Morgan stood in my living room wearing my late husband's favorite apron, pointing toward the kitchen with the kind of authority you'd expect from someone giving orders to hired help. "B," she said, her voice saccharine sweet, but her eyes cold as winter. "The guests will be arriving in an hour. Make sure you have the appetizers ready, and remember, when you serve the drinks, don't linger. Just smile, serve, and disappear back to the kitchen." Behind her, my own grandson Jude avoided my eyes just like he'd been doing for the past 6 months, scrolling through his phone as if his grandmother being treated like domestic staff was perfectly normal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. So I tied that apron around my waist, walked into the kitchen of the home I'd lived in for 43 years, and started preparing hors d'oeuvres for people who would spend the evening talking about me like I wasn't there, never knowing that in exactly 4 hours, I would make one phone call that would remind them all exactly whose name was still on the deed, the bank accounts, and every legal document they'd conveniently forgotten about. At 75 years old, I never imagined I'd be polishing wine, glasses in my own dining room while my grandson's wife explained to me how to properly arrange canapes on the good china. China that had belonged to my grandmother and had graced this table for family celebrations for over a century. The Riverside Victorian that my late husband Edgar and I had purchased in 1981 with our life savings had become my prison, and I had somehow become the unpaid help. "B, make sure you use the cloth napkins, not the paper ones," Morgan called, from the living room where she was rearranging my furniture to better accommodate her dinner party. "And when Mr. Patterson asks about the wine selection, just tell him it was Edgar's collection. Don't try to explain anything about vintages. You know how you get confused about those details." Confused. That word had become Morgan's favorite. Weapon against me. Deployed whenever I questioned her decisions about my own home or dared to assert any opinion about how things should be done. According to Morgan, I was confused when I objected to her moving my bedroom furniture. I was confused when I asked why she'd thrown away Edgar's medical journals without asking me. I was confused when I wondered aloud why she needed to reorganize my kitchen cabinets and relocate my mother's recipe box to the basement. The truth was, I wasn't confused about anything. I was trapped. It had started innocently enough, 18. Months ago when Jude called to tell me about Morgan, the woman he'd fallen head over heels for after meeting her at a real estate seminar in downtown Portland. She was 32, ambitious, and worked for a property management company that specialized in maximizing residential potential, whatever that meant. When she moved in with Jude in his cramped studio apartment, I'd been genuinely happy for my grandson. At 28, he'd been single for so long that I'd started to worry he'd never find someone to share his life with. The problems began when Morgan started talking about how much money Jude was wasting on rent when his grandmother had all why, that empty space in her house. She painted it as a practical solution that would benefit everyone. Jude could save money, I wouldn't be alone in such a big house, and Morgan could help me with the overwhelming responsibilities of maintaining a Victorian property at my age. "Think about it, B," she'd said during one of their Sunday visits, her voice full of concern that I now recognize as completely manufactured. "You're rattling around in this huge house all by yourself. What if something happened? What if you fell down those stairs? Jude worries about you constantly." The guilt was perfectly applied. Of course I wanted to help my grandson save money. Of course I didn't want him worrying about me. And the house did feel impossibly large and quiet since Edgar passed away 3 years earlier. When they moved in last summer, I'd convinced myself it was a blessing. Family back in the house, young voices in the hallways, shared meals around. The dining room table that had sat mostly empty since I'd lost my husband. The changes started small. Morgan suggested that the formal dining room would make a perfect home office for Jude since he'd started working remotely for a tech startup. She thought the sitting room off the master bedroom would be ideal for her yoga practice and meditation sessions. The library, she claimed, had the best natural light for her video calls with clients. Before I knew it, I was being gradually nudged out of the spaces I'd occupied for 4 decades. My morning coffee routine in the sunroom was interrupted by Morgan's important business calls. My afternoon reading time in the library was cut short by her essential client meetings. Even the kitchen, my domain for 43 years, became a source of constant tension when Morgan decided to implement meal prep Sundays that required exclusive use of the entire space for hours at a time. But the real shift happened when Morgan started referring to my living arrangement as charity. "She lives here for free," I overheard her telling someone on the phone one evening while I was watering plants on the back porch. "No rent, no utilities, no household expenses. The least she can do is help out when we have guests over. I mean, she's here all day anyway, and it gives her something to do. Free." As if the house I'd been paying the mortgage on for over 40 years was some kind of generous gift that Morgan was providing out of the kindness of her heart. Tonight's dinner party was just the latest in a series of increasingly humiliating situations where I was expected to serve Morgan's friends and colleagues, while being treated like invisible domestic help. Last month, during her book club meeting, I'd been asked to refresh everyone's coffee and maybe tidy up the living room a bit, while they discussed literature in the very room where I'd hosted my own book club for 15 years. 2 weeks ago, during Morgan's networking dinner for local real estate professionals, I'd spent the evening washing dishes and clearing plates while listening to conversations about property values and market trends taking place around my own dining room table. Each time, when I'd tried to join the conversation or contribute to discussions about topics I actually knew something about, Morgan would give me that practice smile and redirect, "B, would you mind checking on the dessert?" Or, "Could you grab more wine from the cellar?" The message was always clear. I was the help, not a participant. As I stood in my kitchen tonight, arranging cheese and crackers on my grandmother's silver platter, while Morgan's laughter echoed from the living room, I caught my reflection in the window above the sink. I looked like exactly what Morgan had turned me into, a tired old woman in an apron, serving others in her own home. But what Morgan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this tired old woman had spent 43 years building a life, accumulating assets and making connections that went far beyond this house. She didn't know about the investment portfolios Edgar and I had carefully constructed. She didn't know about the property deeds, the insurance policies, or the legal documents that were safely stored in places she'd never thought to look. Most importantly, she didn't know that treating someone's grandmother like hired help in her own home was about to become the biggest mistake of her very short stay in my house. The doorbell rang, signaling the arrival of the first guests, and Morgan's voice carried into the kitchen. "B, they're here!" I smoothed my apron, picked up the tray of appetizers, and walked toward the living room with a smile. 4 hours. In just 4 hours, this humiliating charade would be over, and Morgan would learn that underestimating a woman who'd been managing her own affairs since before Morgan was born was a very dangerous mistake indeed. My name is Beatrice, B. Henley, and I've spent 75 years learning that dignity isn't something you demand from others. It's something you carry within yourself. For 43 years, Edgar and I built our life in this 3-story Victorian on Maple Street in the historic district of Riverside, Oregon. Every hardwood floor, every piece of crown molding, every carefully tended garden bed represented decades of love, labor, and dreams fulfilled. Edgar was a family physician who ran his practice out of a small clinic downtown for 38 years. I was a retired high school English teacher who spent my career shaping young minds at Riverside High. Together, we raised our daughter Joy in this house, watched her graduate valedictorian, helped her through college, and celebrated when she landed her dream job as a pediatric nurse in Seattle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Joy had given us our greatest gift, our grandson Jude, who spent every summer of his childhood in this house, learning to fish in the Willamette River and helping Edgar tend the vegetable garden that still flourishes in our backyard. This house held memories that belonged to me. The kitchen where I'd taught Joy to make Edgar's favorite apple pie. The living room where we'd hosted countless dinner parties for Edgar's medical colleagues and my fellow teachers. The library where Edgar would read medical journals late into the evening while I graded papers at the antique oak desk that had belonged to my father. The master bedroom where we'd shared our hopes, our fears, and 46 years of marriage until Edgar's sudden heart attack took him from me 3 winters ago. When Edgar died, I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. I was wrong. Edgar had been meticulous about our finances. He'd always said that teachers and doctors might not get rich, but they could get smart about money if they were careful and patient. Over the decades, we'd invested wisely, paid off the house 20 years early, and built a comfortable retirement that would allow me to maintain our home and lifestyle indefinitely. Edgar's life insurance policy had been substantial, and his medical practice had built relationships with financial advisors who continued to manage our portfolio even after his death. The house was mine, free and clear. The investment accounts were mine. The pension from my 35 years of teaching was mine. I wasn't some dependent elderly woman surviving on Social Security and charity. I was a financially secure widow who happened to be grieving the loss of her life partner. But grief, I learned, can make you vulnerable in ways you never expect. The loneliness was the hardest part. After decades of sharing every meal, every evening, every decision with Edgar, the silence in the house felt suffocating. I'd find myself setting 2 places at the breakfast table out of habit, or turning to share a thought with Edgar, only to remember he wasn't there. The house that had always felt like a sanctuary began to feel like a museum of memories I was the sole curator of. When Joy moved to Seattle 15 years ago for her nursing career, we'd maintained our close relationship through weekly phone calls and monthly visits. But Seattle was a 6-hour drive away, and with her demanding schedule at Children's Hospital, those visits had become less frequent over the years. She'd been devastated by Edgar's death, but her own family obligations, her husband Dexter worked long hours as an architect, and they were dealing with his aging parents in Portland, meant she couldn't spend extended time helping me navigate widowhood. That's where Jude came in. My grandson had always been special to me. As Joy's only child, he'd been the center of our attention during those magical childhood summers. I'd taught him to read in the library, helped him with homework at the kitchen table, and listened to his dreams and fears during long walks through the neighborhood. When he graduated from Oregon State with a degree in computer science, I'd been bursting with pride. When he moved to Portland to work for a tech startup, I'd been thrilled that he was close enough for regular visits. After Edgar's funeral, Jude started coming by every Sunday for dinner. We'd sit at the dining room table, and he'd tell me about his work, his friends, his hopes for the future. I'd share stories about his grandfather, his mother's childhood, and the family history he'd never heard. Those Sunday dinners became the highlight of my week, the one day when the house felt alive again with conversation and laughter. Jude was a good boy, raised with strong values by Joy and Dexter. He was kind, thoughtful, and genuinely seemed to enjoy spending time with his grandmother. He'd inherited Edgar's analytical mind and my love of reading. He was also, I had to admit, somewhat naive about people's motivations. At 28, he'd never been seriously hurt by anyone, never had his trust betrayed, never encountered someone who might see his goodness as a weakness to exploit. When he started talking about Morgan last year, I was genuinely happy for him. He'd been single for so long, not because he couldn't find dates, but because he was particular about finding someone who shared his values and ambitions. Morgan sounded perfect, educated, ambitious, successful in her own right. When he brought her to Sunday dinner for the first time, I was prepared to love her simply because she made Jude happy. Morgan Carter was undeniably attractive. Tall, blonde, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested professional success. She wore expensive clothes, drove a luxury car, and spoke confidently about her work in property management. She seemed intelligent and articulate, asking thoughtful questions about the house's history and complimenting the original architectural details that Edgar and I had worked so hard to preserve. She also paid attention to me in a way that felt refreshing after months of being treated by others as if my grief had made me fragile. She asked about my teaching career, my interests, my opinions on current events. She complimented my cooking and seemed genuinely interested in family stories. For the first few months, I thought I'd gained not just a granddaughter-in-law, but a friend. The first warning sign came during her third Sunday dinner with us. As I was showing her family photos, in the living room, she paused at a picture of Edgar and me taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. "It must be so difficult managing everything on your own now," she'd said, her voice full of sympathy. "This house is so large, and maintaining a property like this must be overwhelming at your age." At your age. The phrase struck me as odd, coming from someone who'd just spent an hour listening to me discuss current books I was reading, volunteer work I was doing with the Literacy Council, and plans I was making for redecorating the guest room. I hadn't given any indication that I was struggling with anything, let alone being overwhelmed by my own home. But I dismissed my discomfort, telling myself that Morgan was simply showing concern for my well-being. Grief, I reasoned, might have made me overly sensitive to implications that weren't really there. I should have trusted my instincts. The transformation of Morgan from concerned future granddaughter-in-law to calculating opportunist didn't happen overnight. Like most skilled manipulators, she was patient, methodical, and brilliant at reading people's vulnerabilities. What I mistook for genuine care was actually reconnaissance. It started with small observations during those Sunday dinners. Morgan would comment on how challenging it must be for me to manage the property taxes on such a large home. She'd express concern about the burden of maintaining the Victorian's original features, suggesting that the upkeep must be exhausting for someone my age. She'd wonder aloud whether I'd ever considered downsizing to something more manageable. Each comment was delivered with such apparent concern that I initially felt grateful for her attention. After months of well-meaning friends tiptoeing around my grief, Morgan's direct acknowledgement of practical challenges felt refreshing. She seemed to understand that widowhood involved more than just emotional adjustment. There were financial decisions, property management, and daily responsibilities that had shifted entirely onto my shoulders. What I didn't realize was that Morgan was methodically cataloging every aspect of my life that could be framed as evidence of someone who was struggling to cope independently. The first major red flag came 6 months into their relationship, during what should have been a routine dinner conversation. Morgan had been asking about the house's history, how long Edgar and I had lived there, what improvements we'd made over the years, what the property was worth in today's market. I'd answered her questions gladly, proud of the life Edgar and I had built and happy to share family history with someone who seemed genuinely interested. Then she asked about the practical challenges of maintaining such a large property. "I imagine the heating bills alone must be substantial," she said, cutting her pot roast with precise movements. "And with property taxes in this neighborhood, plus maintenance, insurance, it must be overwhelming to manage all those expenses on a fixed income." The assumption that I was on a fixed income struck me as odd. I'd never given any indication that money was tight, never complained about expenses, never suggested that maintaining the house was financially difficult. In fact, Edgar and I had been quite comfortable, and his life insurance had left me more than adequately provided for. "Actually," I'd replied, "Edgar and I were quite careful about financial planning. The house is paid off, and between my teacher's pension and our investments, I'm quite comfortable." Morgan's smile had flickered for just a moment, so briefly that I almost missed it. But I caught something in her expression that looked like disappointment, frustration, Before I could analyze it further, she'd recovered her composure and moved on to asking Jude about his work, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Why would Morgan be disappointed to learn that I was financially secure? The second red flag came 2 weeks later, when Morgan suggested that Jude and I should have the conversation about my long-term care plans. I know it's an uncomfortable topic, she'd said, her voice full of manufactured empathy. But Jude worries about what would happen if you had a medical emergency or started having mobility issues. At your age, living alone in a 3-story house with all those stairs. She'd trailed off meaningfully, letting the implications hang in the air. The suggestion was clear. I was a fall risk, a medical emergency waiting to happen, a burden that my grandson would inevitably have to handle. I'm 75, not 95. I'd replied, perhaps more sharply than necessary. I walk 3 miles every morning. I volunteer at the library twice a week, and my last physical showed that I'm in excellent health for my age. Morgan had backpedaled immediately, claiming she was just thinking ahead, just being practical, just concerned about my welfare. But I'd noticed how quickly she'd moved to frame my independence as temporary and my current living situation as unsustainable. The third red flag should have been impossible to miss, but grief and loneliness had made me more vulnerable than I wanted to admit. During a Sunday dinner in early spring, Morgan had brought up the topic of living arrangements. You know, she'd said, as if the idea had just occurred to her. Jude and I have been talking, and we're both concerned about you being here all alone. This house is so big, and you're rattling around in it by yourself. What if something happened? What if you needed help? Jude had nodded along, clearly having been coached in this conversation beforehand. We just worry, Grandma. Maybe it would make sense for us to move in here, at least temporarily. That way we could help with the house and you wouldn't be alone. The offer had been presented as a favor to me. Protection, companionship, assistance, with household management. But I'd caught the subtle financial undertone. They would help with the house in exchange for free housing. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable arrangement. Jude could save money on rent, I would have company, and the house would feel alive again with young voices. What I failed to recognize was that Morgan had been building toward this moment for months, carefully establishing the narrative that I was struggling, isolated, and in need of assistance. She'd positioned herself and Jude as the reluctant but caring family members who were willing to sacrifice their own independence to help poor, overwhelmed Grandma B. The speed with which things changed after they moved in should have been my first clue that I'd been manipulated into the arrangement. Within 2 weeks, Morgan had rearranged the living room furniture to improve traffic flow. Within a month, she'd claimed the library as her home office because it had the best natural light for video conferences. Within 6 weeks, she'd suggested that I might be more comfortable using the small sitting room off the kitchen for my morning coffee, since the main dining room was needed for Jude's work calls. Each change was presented as a minor adjustment that would benefit everyone. Each suggestion came with logical explanations and apparent concern for my comfort. But the cumulative effect was that I was being systematically pushed out of my own living spaces and into increasingly marginal areas of my own home. The transformation of our relationship dynamic was even more insidious. During those first few weeks, Morgan had maintained the pretense of respect and consultation. She would ask my opinion about household changes, include me in decisions about meals and social plans, and defer to my knowledge about the house's quirks and maintenance needs. But gradually, those consultations became notifications. Instead of asking if I minded her using the library for work, she would inform me that she needed the space. Instead of checking with me about social plans, she would tell me when her friends were coming over and what role she expected me to play in hosting them. The shift from, "Would you mind if," to "I need you to," happened so gradually that I didn't realize how completely the power dynamic had changed. until it was too late to object without seeming unreasonable. By the time Morgan started referring to my living situation as charity, living, for free in exchange for household help, she had successfully reframed our entire arrangement. I was no longer the homeowner graciously providing housing to family members. I was the dependent elderly relative who was being cared for out of duty and deserved to contribute household labor in exchange for room and board. The most brilliant part of her manipulation was how she'd made me complicit in my own diminishment. Every time I'd agreed to a small change, every time I'd accepted a suggestion about what might be easier or more comfortable for me, I'd participated in building the case that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. The first few weeks after Jude and Morgan moved in felt like a honeymoon period. The house was alive with conversation again, filled with the sounds of daily life that I'd missed so desperately since Edgar's death. Morgan would make coffee in the mornings and ask about my plans for the day. Jude would work from the dining room table, occasionally calling out questions about the house's quirks or asking me to share stories about his childhood summers here. We'd have dinner together most evenings, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was part of a family again, instead of just a woman rattling around in rooms full of memories. But slowly, subtly, things began to shift. It started with Morgan's helpful suggestions about optimizing the living spaces. The formal dining room, she mentioned one morning over coffee, would make such a perfect home office for Jude. The natural light was excellent, and he wouldn't disturb anyone with his video calls if he had a dedicated workspace. It made perfect sense, she explained. I rarely use the formal dining room anyway, except for special occasions, and this way Jude could be more productive. We could move your coffee routine to the breakfast nook, she suggested sweetly. It's much cozier for one person, and you'll have a lovely view of the garden while you read the morning paper. The breakfast nook, a space barely large enough. For 2 people, tucked into a corner of the kitchen where I'd normally only eat quick meals or sort mail. But Morgan made it sound like an upgrade, a more intimate and comfortable alternative to the spacious dining room where Edgar and I had shared 43 years of morning conversations. I agreed because it seemed reasonable. Jude did need workspace, and I could certainly drink my coffee anywhere. But something about being relocated to the breakfast nook felt diminishing in a way I couldn't quite articulate at the time. Next came the library. Morgan had been using it for her own video conferences, claiming that the afternoon light was perfect for client calls and the built-in bookshelves provided a professional backdrop. What had started as occasional use gradually became daily occupation. My afternoon reading time, a sacred ritual I'd maintained since my teaching days, was increasingly interrupted by Morgan's urgent client meetings that seemed to run longer. Each day, "I'm so sorry, Bea," she'd say, appearing in the doorway with her laptop and a stack of real estate folders. "I know you usually read in here, but I have a really important conference call with a potential investor. Would you mind terribly if I used the space for just an hour or 2? How could I say no? She was asking politely, apologizing for the inconvenience, and her work was clearly important. But as the days went by, those hour or 2 sessions stretched into entire afternoons, and my reading time was pushed later and later until I found myself trying to read in the living room after dinner, straining my eyes in inadequate lamplight. When I gently mentioned that I missed having access to the library during my usual reading hours, Morgan's response was swift and cutting. "Oh, Bea, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had such a rigid schedule. I thought retired people were supposed to be more flexible about these things." She laughed as if my attachment to routine was charmingly old-fashioned, but ultimately unreasonable. "Maybe you could try reading in the sunroom. The morning light there is supposed to be wonderful." The morning light. As if I hadn't been living in this house for 4 decades and didn't know perfectly well what light was available in each room at different times of day. As if my preference for reading in the library wasn't based on 43 years of experience with the space I'd helped design and arrange. But the most insidious change was how Morgan began reframing my relationship to my own home. Instead of being the gracious homeowner who was providing housing to family members, I was gradually repositioned as the elderly relative who was being cared for by generous younger people. Bee's been so good about letting us reorganize things, I heard her tell someone during a phone conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. I think she's starting to realize that managing such a large house was becoming too much for her. We're just trying to make things easier and more efficient for everyone. Too much for me. As if the house I'd successfully maintained for 4 decades had suddenly become beyond my capabilities, simply because I'd reached my 75th birthday. The language Morgan used when talking about our living arrangement was particularly calculated. She never said that she and Jude were staying in my house. Instead, she would refer to our shared living space, or mention how we're all learning to navigate this multi-generational arrangement. The subtle implication was that this was somehow a mutual housing situation, rather than my providing accommodation to family members who couldn't afford their own place. When Morgan's friends visited, she would introduce me with phrases that simultaneously acknowledged my ownership while undermining my authority. "This is Bee, Jude's grandmother. She's been so generous about letting us stay here while we save up for our own place." The word letting made it sound like I was granting permission for something that was ultimately their choice, rather than providing housing that they needed, even. More disturbing was how she began documenting what she called my episodes. If I couldn't immediately remember where I'd put my reading glasses, Morgan would make a gentle comment about how these little memory lapses happen to all of us as we get older. If I mentioned that I'd been looking forward to reading in the library and then discovered she was using it for work, she'd express concern about my confusion regarding our agreed-upon schedule. There was no agreed-upon schedule. There had never been any formal arrangement about who could use which spaces when. But Morgan spoke about these fictional agreements with such confidence that I began to doubt my own memory of our conversations. The most damaging episodes involved my perfectly normal attempts to maintain independence and decision-making authority in my own home. When I decided to rearrange the living room furniture back to its original configuration, the way Edgar and I had arranged it and the way it had been for 20 years, Morgan expressed concern about my sudden impulses and suggested that such decisions should be discussed as a family since we all have to live with the changes. When I planned a small dinner party for some of my former teaching colleagues, something I'd done regularly before Edgar's death and had been looking forward to resuming, Morgan worried aloud about whether entertaining was too stressful for me and whether I might be taking on more than I could handle. Each concern was voiced with apparent love and care. Each suggestion was framed as being in my best interest. But the cumulative effect was to establish a pattern where my independent decisions were characterized as impulsive, potentially dangerous, or evidence of declining judgment. The psychological impact was devastating. I began second-guessing decisions I'd been making confidently for decades. I started asking Morgan's opinion about things that had never required consultation with anyone other than Edgar. I found myself apologizing for taking up space in my own home, asking permission to use rooms I'd been using for 43 years, and deferring to Morgan's preferences about everything from meal planning to social scheduling. Most insidiously, I began to internalize the narrative that I was lucky to have such caring family members willing to help me manage my increasingly overwhelming responsibilities. When friends commented on how nice it must be to have young people around the house again, I found myself echoing Morgan's language about how helpful they were and how much easier it made everything. I didn't recognize that I was participating in my own diminishment, building the case that would eventually be used to justify treating me like hired help in my own home. The transformation from subtle manipulation to overt control happened during what I now call the dinner party incident, a moment that should have been my wake-up call, but instead became the blueprint for my complete subjugation in my own home. It was a crisp October evening when Morgan announced that she was hosting a dinner party for some important contacts from her property management company. This wasn't unusual. We'd been entertaining Morgan's colleagues regularly for the past few months. What was different this time was how she handled the planning. Instead of the collaborative approach we'd used for previous gatherings, Morgan presented me with a detailed agenda that had clearly been planned without any input from me. She'd already selected the menu, made the grocery list, and decided on the table settings, all using my grandmother's finest china and crystal that had been carefully preserved for special occasions. "I've planned a lovely evening," she announced over breakfast, sliding a typed list across the table. "Nothing too elaborate, just 7 courses with wine pairings. I know it's a lot of work, but these are really important potential investors, and first impressions matter so much in real estate." I stared at the list, noting dishes that would require hours of preparation, ingredients I'd never worked with, and a timeline that would keep me in the kitchen for the entire day leading up to the party. It was the kind of elaborate dinner that Edgar and I might have planned together for our anniversary, not something I'd be expected to execute single-handedly for my houseguests' business associates. "This is quite ambitious," I said carefully. "Perhaps we could simplify the menu, or I could help with some of the preparation." Morgan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, B, I really need this to be perfect. These people could potentially invest in some major development projects, and the evening needs to reflect a certain level of sophistication. You understand, don't you?" The implication was clear. My cooking abilities were being questioned. My judgment about appropriate entertaining was being dismissed. And my role was to execute her vision rather than contribute my own ideas. But the real shock came when I suggested that I would, of course, join the dinner party as a hostess. After all, it was my home, my dining room, and my china that would be creating the elegant atmosphere Morgan was counting on to impress her potential investors. "Actually," Morgan said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I was beginning to recognize, "I think it would be better if you focused on the kitchen duties. These conversations are going to be quite technical. Lots of industry jargon and financial details that might be confusing. Besides, someone needs to manage the courses and keep the wine flowing smoothly." I felt as if I'd been slapped. "Morgan, this is my home. These people are guests in my house." "Of course it's your home," she said quickly, but her tone suggested she was humoring an unreasonable child. "And you're being so generous by letting us use it for this important business dinner. But B, you have to understand. These are sophisticated people who are used to a certain level of service. We can't have any awkward moments or misunderstandings that might jeopardize these relationships." Awkward moments, misunderstandings. The suggestion that my presence at my own dinner table would somehow embarrass Morgan or reflect poorly on her professionalism was breathtaking in its audacity. But the most devastating part was that Jude said nothing. My own grandson sat at the breakfast table, reading something on his phone, and didn't object to his girlfriend relegating his grandmother to kitchen staff in her own home. When I looked at him directly, hoping for some sign of protest or discomfort with Morgan's plan, he glanced up briefly and said, "Maybe it would be less stressful for you, Grandma. You know how you get anxious when there are too many people around." I do not get anxious around people. I'd been hosting dinner parties for 40 years, had entertained Edgar's medical colleagues countless times, and had been the social center of our neighborhood for decades. But somehow, in Jude's mind, I had become a fragile elderly woman who needed to be protected from the stress of normal social interaction. That evening, I found myself preparing and serving a 7-course meal to people who barely acknowledged my existence. When I appeared with each course, conversation would pause politely until I left the room, then resume as if I were invisible domestic help rather than the homeowner whose hospitality was making their elegant evening possible. The conversations, I overheard while serving were about property development opportunities, zoning changes, and investment strategies. Topics I actually knew something about, having lived in this community for 43 years and having watched the neighborhood evolve through multiple development cycles. But my knowledge and experience were irrelevant because I'd been relegated to serving staff. The most humiliating moment came when one of Morgan's guests complimented the meal and asked about the recipe for the braised short ribs. Instead of directing the question to me, the person who had spent 6 hours preparing the dish, Morgan smiled graciously and said, "Oh, that's one of our family recipes. My partner's grandmother is quite the cook." Our family recipe. As if the dish I'd learned from my own mother and had been perfecting for decades was somehow communal property that Morgan could claim credit for. After the guests left, as I was, cleaning the kitchen at nearly midnight, Morgan breezed in with the kind of satisfied expression someone wears after a successful performance. "That went perfectly," she announced, pouring herself a glass of the wine that was left over. Mr. Richards said it was one of the most elegant dinners he'd attended in months. "You did a wonderful job with the food, B." You did a wonderful job. As if I were hired catering staff receiving feedback from a satisfied customer rather than the homeowner who had provided everything that made the evening possible. When I didn't respond immediately, too exhausted and humiliated to summon an appropriate reaction, Morgan's tone shifted to concern. "You look tired. Maybe hosting is becoming too much for you? We should probably keep future entertaining smaller and simpler, don't you think?" The brilliance of her manipulation was becoming clear. By pushing me beyond reasonable limits and then expressing concern about my ability to handle the workload, she was creating evidence that I was struggling with responsibilities that had previously been well within my capabilities. That night, lying in my bed in the house I'd called home for 43 years, I realized that Morgan wasn't just taking advantage of my hospitality. She was systematically demonstrating that I was no longer capable of managing my own social life, my own home, or my own decisions. And my own grandson was not only allowing it to happen, he was actively participating in building the case against my competence. The breaking point came during Morgan's birthday celebration, an event that transformed my home into a stage for my complete public humiliation. What should have been a simple family gathering became a calculated demonstration of exactly how far my status had fallen in my own house. Morgan had been planning her 30th birthday party for weeks, discussing guest lists and catering options as if the decision were entirely hers to make. When I suggested that we could prepare a nice dinner together, something I'd done for countless birthday celebrations in this house over the decades, Morgan's response was swift and cutting. "Oh, B, that's so sweet of you to offer. But I've already arranged for professional catering. I know how stressful entertaining can be for you, and I want this to be perfect. You can just relax and enjoy being a guest at the party." A guest? At a party in my own home, for a woman who'd been living there for less than a year. But I went along with it, telling myself that it was her birthday, and she deserved to celebrate however she wanted. I even offered to help with decorations or setup, thinking that surely there would be some way for me to contribute to the occasion in a meaningful way. The morning of the party, I discovered exactly what role Morgan had in mind for me. "B," she said, appearing in the kitchen where I was having my morning coffee, "I need you to understand something about tonight. This isn't just a birthday party. It's really important for my career. Several potential investors will be here, along with some major players in Portland real estate. The impression we make tonight could determine whether I get the promotion I've been working toward." I nodded, waiting for her to explain how I could help ensure the evening went smoothly. "So, I need you to be very careful about inserting yourself into conversations that might be over your head. These people deal with complex financial instruments and development strategies that can be quite technical. I wouldn't want you to feel confused or left out." The condescension was breathtaking, but she wasn't finished. "Actually, it would probably be best if you could help with serving duties. You know, making sure drinks are refreshed, clearing plates, that sort of thing. It would be such a help, and honestly, it would give you something useful to do instead of just standing around feeling awkward. Something useful to do. As if my 43 years of hosting successful dinner parties in this very house had somehow become irrelevant. As if my presence as anything other than serving staff would be an embarrassment to her and her sophisticated friends. When I started to object, Morgan's expression shifted to that practiced look of patient concern I'd come to know so well. B, I know this is your house, and I'm grateful for everything you do for us. But tonight is really important for my future, and I need to know that everything will go smoothly. You understand, don't you? The emotional blackmail was expertly applied. If I insisted on participating as an equal hostess, I would be sabotaging Morgan's career prospects. If I objected to being relegated to serving duties, I would be selfish and unsupportive. The only acceptable response was gracious compliance with my own diminishment. That evening, I found myself wearing an apron in my own dining room, serving canapés to strangers who looked through me as if I were invisible hired help. The conversations I overheard while refilling wine glasses were about topics I knew intimately: neighborhood development patterns, zoning decisions, property values in the historic district. These were subjects I'd been involved with for decades, through community planning committees and neighborhood association meetings. But when I attempted to contribute to a discussion about proposed changes to the waterfront development, the response was politely dismissive. "Oh, how nice that you're interested in local politics," one of Morgan's guests said with the kind of smile reserved for children who've said something unexpectedly charming. "It's wonderful when seniors stay engaged with community issues." Seniors. As if my age automatically disqualified me from having informed opinions about the community I'd been part of for 4 decades. Morgan quickly steered the conversation away from my attempted participation. "B, could you check on the appetizers?" "In the kitchen? I think we might need fresh plates." The message was clear. My role was to serve, not to participate. My knowledge and experience were irrelevant. My presence at the conversation was unwelcome. But the most devastating moment came when I overheard Morgan talking to a small group near the fireplace. I was in the adjacent hallway, gathering empty glasses, when her voice carried clearly to where I stood. "Living with Jude's grandmother has been such a learning experience," she was saying, her tone suggesting she was sharing something both touching and challenging. "She tries so hard to stay involved in everything, but you can see that managing this big house is really becoming too much for her. We're trying to help her transition gradually to a more manageable lifestyle." One of her listeners made sympathetic noises. "That must be difficult. My mother went through something similar. It's so hard when they don't want to admit they need help." "Exactly," Morgan replied. "The hardest part is that she still thinks she can do everything herself. Last week, she insisted on hosting her book club, and it was honestly a little painful to watch. She kept forgetting which refreshments she'd planned to serve, and she seemed confused about the timing. But she gets so upset if we try to suggest that maybe some activities are becoming too challenging." Every word was a lie. My book club meeting had gone perfectly. I'd served the same lemon bars and coffee that I'd been making for the group for 15 years, and the timing had been exactly what we'd agreed upon. But Morgan was telling a story that painted me as a confused elderly woman desperately clinging to activities beyond her capabilities. "Have you considered assisted living?" another guest asked. "There are some lovely places that really don't feel institutional at all." "We've talked about it," Morgan said, and I felt my blood run cold. "But she's very attached to this house. Jude thinks we should try to make things work here for as long as possible. Maybe hire some help, or make some modifications to keep her safe. Hire some help, make modifications to keep me safe." They were discussing my future as if I were an incompetent ward rather than the homeowner who was providing them with free housing. The conversation continued, but I couldn't bear to hear more. I walked back to the kitchen on unsteady legs, my hands shaking as I set down the glasses I'd collected. In the space of one overheard conversation, I'd learned that Morgan wasn't just treating me like domestic help. She was building a public narrative about my declining capabilities that would justify whatever decisions she wanted to make about my future. That night, after the guests had gone and the catered dishes had been cleared away, I sat alone in the kitchen of my own home and realized that I was no longer the mistress of this house. I had become a problem to be managed, a burden to be handled, an obstacle to be worked around. And my own grandson, who should have been protecting me from this treatment, was apparently an active participant in planning my diminished future. The moment that changed everything happened 3 days after Morgan's birthday party, in the most ordinary of circumstances. I was deadheading roses in Edgar's memorial garden, a peaceful morning ritual that had become one of my few remaining sanctuaries, when Morgan's voice carried clearly across the lawn from the back patio where she was having what she thought was a private phone conversation. "No, Daddy, you don't understand," she was saying, her voice sharp with frustration. "The timeline has to be accelerated. She's more stubborn than we anticipated. And frankly, she's starting to ask questions about the house expenses that I can't keep deflecting forever." I froze behind the rose bush, my pruning shears still in my hand. House expenses? What house? Expenses? I paid all the bills for this property and had never asked Morgan to contribute financially to anything. "I know the original plan was to wait until next spring," Morgan continued. "But I think we need to move forward with the competency evaluation by Christmas. Dr. Kellerman says if we can document enough incidents of confusion and poor judgment, we can have guardianship established within 90 days. My blood turned to ice. Competency evaluation, guardianship, Dr. Kellerman, a name I didn't recognize, which meant Morgan had been consulting with medical professionals about my mental state without my knowledge or consent. The property assessment came back at $2.8 million, which is even better than we hoped. Morgan's voice took on an excited edge. "With the development potential, especially if we can get the historic designation removed, we're looking at close to $4 million in total value. Maybe more if the luxury condo market stays strong. Development potential, historic designation removed. They weren't just planning to take control of my life. They were planning to destroy the home Edgar and I had lovingly preserved for 4 decades and turn it into profitable real estate." "Jude is completely on board now," Morgan continued. First he felt guilty about the whole thing, but once I explained how much easier her life would be in managed care, he started seeing it as the compassionate option. Plus, his share of the inheritance will set us up for life. His share of the inheritance. As if I were already dead. As if my life's work and Edgar's legacy were already divided up and distributed according to their plans. No, she hasn't been officially diagnosed with anything yet, Morgan said in response to something her father had asked. But Dr. Kellerman specializes in these cases, and she says the behavioral documentation we've been collecting should be more than sufficient. The key is establishing a pattern of declining judgment and inability to manage complex decisions. Behavioral documentation. I thought about all the times Morgan had made concerned comments about my confusion or memory lapses, incidents that I now realized were either completely fabricated or normal moments twisted into evidence of cognitive decline. "Trust me, by the time we're done, even she'll believe she needs the help." Morgan laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "The beauty of this approach is that the victim actually becomes grateful for the intervention. She'll think we're saving her from herself." I stayed hidden behind the roses until Morgan finished her call and went back into the house, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then I walked on trembling legs to the garden bench Edgar had installed for me years ago and sat down to process what I'd just learned. Everything suddenly made horrifying sense. The gradual isolation from my own spaces, the constant suggestions that I was struggling to cope, the documentation of fictional episodes of confusion. Morgan hadn't just taken advantage of my grief and loneliness. She had been systematically building a legal case to have me declared incompetent so they could seize control of my property and my life. and this wasn't an impulsive scheme born from greed. This was a calculated, long-term plan that involved medical professionals, legal strategies, and timeline management. Morgan had apparently done this before, or at least knew exactly how to execute a guardianship fraud. I thought about Dr. Kellerman, a doctor I'd never heard of who was apparently evaluating my mental competence based on fictional reports of confusion and poor judgment. I thought about the development potential they'd discussed, which would require destroying the historic character of the property Edgar and I had spent decades preserving. I thought about Jude, my own grandson, who had been convinced that stealing his grandmother's independence was somehow an act of compassion. The most chilling part was Morgan's confidence that I would eventually be grateful for their intervention. She understood the psychology of elder abuse well enough to know that if the manipulation was done skillfully, victims could be made to believe that their diminished autonomy was actually a kindness. I sat in that garden for a long time, watching the morning sun illuminate the roses Edgar had planted, the vegetables he'd tended, the fruit trees we'd chosen together. This wasn't just my home. It was our legacy, the physical manifestation of a life well lived and love deeply shared. And Morgan was planning to turn it into condominiums. But as I sat there, feeling the solid earth beneath my feet and breathing the air scented with Edgar's roses, something shifted inside me. The hurt and confusion that had plagued me for months began transforming into something much more powerful. Cold, clear rage. I wasn't a confused old woman struggling to manage her affairs. I was a 75-year-old retired teacher who had successfully managed complex responsibilities for decades. I had taught high school students for 35 years, which meant I had extensive experience recognizing manipulation, deception, and elaborate schemes designed to take advantage of perceived authority figures. More importantly, I had resources Morgan didn't know about. Edgar's life insurance had been substantial, but our real financial security came from investments and property holdings that predated Morgan's presence in our lives. I had relationships with financial advisors, attorneys, and medical professionals who had known me for decades and could attest to my mental competence. Most crucially, I now knew exactly what Morgan was planning, which meant I could prepare a defense before she had a chance to implement her attack. I stood up from the garden bench, brushed the soil from my hands, and walked back toward the house with purpose I hadn't felt in months. Morgan thought she was dealing with an isolated, vulnerable elderly woman who could be manipulated into surrendering her autonomy. She was about to learn that she had severely underestimated her opponent. By the time I reached the back door, I had already decided that the phone call I would make that afternoon would remind Morgan and Jude exactly whose name was on every deed, every bank account, and every legal document they had conveniently forgotten about. The war they had started, in secret, was about to become very public, and they were not prepared for the fight they were about to face. The phone call that would change everything happened that very afternoon. But first, I needed to gather my thoughts and plan my approach, carefully. I walked through my house, looking at it with new eyes, seeing not the home where I was being systematically diminished, but the fortress that would protect me in the battle ahead. In Edgar's study, I pulled out the filing cabinet that Morgan had probably never noticed, hidden behind medical journals and teaching awards. Inside were documents that told the real story of our financial situation. Investment portfolios worth considerably more than the house itself, certificates of deposit that Edgar had been methodically building for decades, and life insurance, proceeds that had made me one of the wealthier widows in Riverside. More importantly, I found Edgar's address book, filled with contacts Morgan knew nothing about. Dr. Patricia Wells, my physician for the past 15 years, who had seen me just 3 months ago for my annual physical and declared me in excellent health for my age. Robert Chen, no relation to Morgan's fabricated surname, my financial advisor who had been managing our investments since Edgar's retirement. And Margaret Rosenberg, the attorney who had handled Edgar's estate and knew better than anyone that I was fully competent to manage my own affairs. But the most important number in that book belonged to Sarah Martinez, Edgar's former colleague, who had become one of Portland's most respected geriatric psychiatrists. Sarah had been a frequent guest at our dinner parties over the years and would have no trouble distinguishing between normal aging and actual cognitive decline. I sat at Edgar's desk, surrounded by the evidence of a life carefully planned and well-lived, and made my first strategic decision. Instead of confronting Morgan directly or alerting her to what I'd overheard, I would do what any good teacher does when facing a problem. I would gather information, build my case, and prepare for every possible counter-argument before making my move. I picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's office. Dr. Martinez's office. This is Janet. Hello, Janet. This is Beatrice Henley. I was wondering if Dr. Martinez might have time to see me this week for a consultation. Of course, Mrs. Henley. Dr. Martinez always has time for you. Is this regarding your health? I paused, choosing my words carefully. I'm concerned that someone may be questioning my mental competence, and I'd like to have a professional evaluation to establish a baseline. There was a brief silence. Mrs. Henley, would you like me to schedule this as an urgent appointment? Dr. Martinez has an opening tomorrow afternoon. That would be perfect. After hanging up, I made 3 more calls. Dr. Wells agreed to provide my complete medical records. Robert Chen confirmed that I had been managing complex financial decisions without any assistance and offered to document my competence in writing. Margaret Rosenberg was more direct. B. What you're describing sounds like the beginning of a guardianship scam. How quickly can you come to my office? I can be there within the hour. Good. And B? Don't mention this to anyone living in your house. If they're planning what I think they're planning, any warning could accelerate their timeline. As I gathered my purse and car keys, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. For months, I'd been seeing a confused, diminished old woman looking back at me. But today, I saw Beatrice Henley, retired educator, widow, homeowner, and a woman who had spent 75 years learning how to fight for what mattered. Morgan had made a critical error in her planning. She had assumed that isolation and manipulation would leave me too confused and dependent to mount an effective defense. What she failed to understand was that teachers are trained to recognize manipulation, to document evidence, and to build cases that can withstand scrutiny. More importantly, she had underestimated the power of relationships built over decades. While she had been busy cutting me off from my daily routines and social spaces, she had forgotten that I had professional and personal connections throughout this community that went back 40 years. I left the house quietly, telling Morgan I was going to the grocery store, a mundane errand that would give me several hours to work without arousing suspicion. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw her watching from the kitchen window, probably congratulating herself on how well her plan was proceeding. By the time I returned home that evening, I would have a complete psychological evaluation establishing my mental competence, legal documentation of my financial capacity, medical records proving my physical health, and an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. Morgan thought she was weeks away from implementing her scheme. She had no idea that her target had just transformed into her most dangerous opponent. Margaret Rosenberg's law office hadn't changed much in the 3 years since Edgar's death. The same diplomas hung on the walls, the same leather-bound legal volumes lined the shelves, and Margaret herself remained the sharp-eyed woman who had guided us through 4 decades of legal decisions with wisdom and precision. "B," she said, standing to embrace me as I entered her office. "You look upset. Tell me everything." For the next hour, I walked Margaret through every detail of Morgan's manipulation, from the initial suggestions about optimizing living spaces to the overheard phone conversation that had revealed the true scope of their plan. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in her precise handwriting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair with the expression I remembered from contentious negotiations, calculating, determined, and slightly predatory. "What you're describing is textbook elder financial abuse," she said. "The gradual isolation, the documented incidents, the manufactured concerns about competency. It's a sophisticated operation. Morgan clearly has experience with this type of fraud. She pulled a thick file from her desk drawer. After your call, I did some preliminary research on Morgan Carter, the property management company she claims to work for. It exists, but she's not an employee. She's actually a consultant who specializes in what they call estate transition services, helping families navigate the process of moving elderly relatives into care facilities while maximizing asset recovery. The words hit me like ice water. She's done this before, multiple times, based on what I could find. There are at least 3 other cases in Oregon and California where Morgan was involved in relationships with men who had elderly parents with substantial assets. In each case, the elderly person ended up in managed care, and the property was sold for development. Margaret opened another folder. The most recent case was 2 years ago in Sacramento. A 78-year-old widower named Frank Morrison who owned a historic Victorian in the downtown area. Morgan dated his son for 8 months, moved into the house, and gradually established guardianship over Frank after documenting his declining cognitive abilities. The house was sold 6 months later to a developer who turned it into luxury condominiums. I felt sick. What happened to Frank? He's in a memory care facility in Stockton. According to the records, he tried to contest the guardianship, but by then the documentation against him was overwhelming. Morgan had been very thorough in building her case. The pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. So, I'm not her first victim. You're not even her second or third. But here's the difference. In all the previous cases, the victims didn't discover the plan until it was too late to mount an effective defense. You have a significant advantage because you know what she's planning before she's had a chance to implement it. Margaret pulled out a legal pad and began making a list. Here's what we're going to do. First, Dr. Martinez will conduct a comprehensive psychological evaluation that establishes your complete mental competency. Second, Dr. Wells will provide medical documentation of your physical health and cognitive function. Third, Robert Chen will create a financial competency assessment showing that you've been managing complex assets independently without any problems. She continued writing. Fourth, we're going to have you evaluated by a second geriatric psychiatrist, someone Morgan has never heard of, to eliminate any possibility that her Dr. Kellerman could challenge our findings. Fifth, we're going to document every lie she's told about your behavior and every fabricated incident she's reported. What about the legal aspects? I'm filing papers tomorrow to establish what's called a pre-need guardianship declaration. It's a legal document that explicitly states who you want to make decisions for you if you ever become incapacitated, and more importantly, who you specifically do not want to have that authority. Even if Morgan somehow succeeded in having you declared incompetent, this document would prevent her or Jude from becoming your guardian. Margaret's smile turned sharp. But the most important thing we're going to do is gather evidence of her fraud. If we can prove that she's systematically targeted elderly people for financial exploitation, this becomes a criminal matter, rather than just a family dispute. She handed me a small digital recording device. I want you to document every conversation, every suggestion about your competency, every comment about your living situation. Oregon is a one-party consent state, which means you can legally record conversations without telling the other person. The device felt heavy in my hand, weighted with possibility and danger. What if she discovers what I'm doing? Then we accelerate our timeline. But B, I need you to understand something. What? Morgan's planning isn't just immoral, it's criminal. Elder abuse, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud are serious felonies. If we handle this correctly, she won't just lose access to your property, she'll face decades in prison. For the first time in months, I felt something that had been missing from my life, hope backed by concrete action. Margaret wasn't just telling me that my situation was wrong. She was giving me the tools to fight back effectively. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as I prepared to leave. "I want you to consider whether you're ready for this to destroy your relationship with Jude permanently. If we expose Morgan's fraud, he's either going to realize he's been manipulated and side with you, or he's going to double down on supporting her. Either way, your family dynamic will never be the same." I thought about my grandson, the boy I'd taught to read, the young man I'd been so proud of. Then I thought about Edgar and the values we'd tried to instill in our family. "Margaret," I said, quietly, "if Jude can't see the difference between helping his grandmother and defrauding her, then our family dynamic is already destroyed. I'm just going to make sure everyone else can see it too." The opportunity to spring my trap came sooner than I'd expected, delivered by Morgan herself in the form of an announcement that made my blood run cold and my resolve turn to steel. "B," she said over breakfast 3 days after my meeting with Margaret, "I have some wonderful news. I've arranged for my parents to visit this weekend. They're flying in from San Francisco on Friday, and I thought we could have a nice family dinner on Saturday night." She said it with the bright enthusiasm of someone planning a pleasant social gathering, but I caught the calculating look in her eyes. This wasn't a casual family visit. This was the next phase of her plan. "How lovely," I replied, keeping my voice steady while my mind raced. "I'll make sure the guest room is ready." Actually, they're staying at the Riverside Inn downtown. Dad has some business meetings on Monday, so it's more convenient. But thank you for offering. Of course, they weren't staying at the house. They weren't coming to visit their daughter's living situation. They were coming to evaluate the elderly woman who needed to be removed from her own home. Over the next 2 days, I watched Morgan's preparations with new eyes. She scheduled what she called a comprehensive family meeting for Saturday evening, complete with a typed agenda that included discussing B's long-term care options and planning for household management transition. She arranged for catering from an upscale restaurant, claiming she wanted everything to be perfect for her parents' visit. Most tellingly, she made an appointment for Saturday afternoon with someone she described as a family counselor who specializes in multi-generational living arrangements. When I asked for more details, Morgan was vague but reassuring. "Oh, it's just someone who can help us have productive conversations about everyone's needs and concerns. Dr. Kellerman comes highly recommended for these types of family discussions." Dr. Kellerman. The same name I'd heard during the overheard phone conversation, the specialist who could help establish my incompetence for guardianship purposes. Morgan was bringing in her expert witness to evaluate me during what I was supposed to believe was a casual family gathering. I spent those 2 days playing the role of the grateful, slightly confused elderly woman who was touched by all the attention being paid to her welfare. I asked innocent questions about the family meeting, expressed appreciation for Morgan's thoughtfulness in arranging everything, and made small comments that could be interpreted as evidence of my declining cognitive abilities. "I hope I can keep up with all these plans," I said with a self-deprecating laugh. "Sometimes I feel like things are moving so fast these days." "Oh, B," Morgan replied with practiced sympathy. "That's exactly why we want to make sure you have all the support you need." Meanwhile, I was conducting my own preparations. Margaret had provided me with a small recording device that looked like a hearing aid, virtually undetectable when worn. Dr. Martinez had completed my psychological evaluation, documenting my complete mental competence in language that would withstand any professional challenge. Most importantly, I had spent hours rehearsing my performance for Saturday evening, because that's what it would be. A performance designed to give Morgan and her allies exactly what they expected to see, right up until the moment I revealed that their victim had been documenting their fraud from the beginning. Friday evening, Morgan's parents arrived as scheduled. David Carter was exactly what I'd expected. A smooth corporate type who assessed my house with the calculating eye of someone evaluating real estate potential. Helen Carter was more subtle, but I caught her making mental notes about my appearance. my speech patterns, and my interactions with Morgan and Jude. "Mrs. Henley," David said, shaking my hand with the kind of firm grip businessmen use to establish dominance. "Morgan has told us so much about you. What a beautiful home you have here." "Thank you," I replied, letting my voice carry just a hint of the frailty Morgan had been claiming I was developing. Edgar and I were very proud of this place, though I have to admit, it's becoming quite a lot to manage on my own. I watched Morgan's eyes light up with satisfaction. In her mind, I was already providing evidence of my declining capacity to live independently. Over dinner, I played my role perfectly. I told stories that meandered, slightly before reaching their conclusions. I asked questions I'd already had answered. I made small mistakes about dates and details that could be interpreted as memory lapses rather than the deliberate misdirection they actually were. But most importantly, I listened carefully to every word of their conversation, recording everything, while appearing to be the confused elderly woman who was only half following the adult discussion happening around her. By Saturday evening, Morgan was practically glowing with confidence. She believed she had successfully assembled all the pieces needed to prove my incompetence: concerned family members, professional evaluation, and documented evidence of my declining abilities. What she didn't know was that I had been building my own case against her for days, and tomorrow's family meeting would be the moment when the hunter realized she had become the prey. Saturday evening arrived with all the precision of a well-orchestrated performance. Morgan had transformed my dining room into what looked like a boardroom, complete with legal pads, printed documents, and a recording device placed conspicuously in the center of the table. Dr. Kellerman, a thin woman in her 50s with calculating eyes, sat beside Morgan's parents like a panel of judges preparing to deliver a verdict. "B," Morgan said with syrupy sweetness, "why don't you sit here at the head of the table? This is all about you, after all." I took my seat, adjusting the small recording device hidden in my hearing aid while maintaining the slightly confused but cooperative expression I'd been perfecting all week. "Now then," Dr. Kellerman began, consulting her notes, "I understand there have been some concerns about Mrs. Henley's ability to manage her daily responsibilities independently." "Oh, yes," Morgan jumped in eagerly. "Just yesterday she forgot where she put her car keys and spent 20 minutes looking for them. And last week she seemed confused about which day her book club was meeting." Both statements were lies, but I said nothing, letting Dr. Kellerman document these fictional incidents while my hidden device recorded every word. "Mrs. Henley," Dr. Kellerman addressed me directly, "how do you feel about managing this large house on your own?" I paused, letting my voice waver slightly. "Well, it is getting more difficult. Sometimes I wonder if I'm not as sharp as I used to be." Morgan's father leaned forward. "Mrs. Henley, we've been researching some excellent assisted living facilities in the area, places where you wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance or meal preparation. The financial aspects are quite manageable, too," Morgan added. "Selling this property would provide more than enough to cover care costs, with plenty left over for your family." For your family. Even in the middle of their fraud, they couldn't help revealing their true motivations. Dr. Kellerman pulled out a thick folder. "Based on my preliminary assessment and the behavioral documentation Morgan has provided, I believe Mrs. Henley would benefit significantly from managed care. Her cognitive decline, while not severe, is progressing at a rate that makes independent living inadvisable." This was the moment. Morgan was practically glowing with satisfaction, believing she had just received professional validation for her scheme. Dr. Kellerman was documenting recommendations that would support a guardianship petition, and Jude sat silently beside them, saying nothing while his grandmother was being evaluated like a piece of property to be disposed of. I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, setting it on the table with deliberate care. "That's very interesting, Dr. Kellerman," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, "because I have some documentation of my own." The change in my demeanor was immediate and shocking. Morgan's confident smile faltered as I opened the envelope and spread its contents across the table. This is a comprehensive psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Sarah Martinez 3 days ago, I announced, documenting my complete mental competency and cognitive function. Dr. Kellerman paled as she recognized Dr. Martinez's name, one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in the state. And this, I continued, pulling out another document, is a financial competency assessment from my investment advisor, Robert Chen, confirming that I've been managing complex financial decisions independently without any assistance or confusion. Morgan's father was staring at the documents as if they were explosive devices. But most importantly, I said, reaching for the recording device hidden in my hearing aid, I have this. I placed the small device on the table and pressed play. Morgan's voice filled the room, crystal clear from the conversation I'd overheard in the garden days earlier. The timeline has to be accelerated. We can have guardianship established within 90 days. The property assessment came back at $2.8 million. Jude is completely on board now. The silence that followed was deafening. Morgan's face had gone white, her parents looked stricken, and Dr. Kellerman was frantically gathering her papers as if preparing to flee. You see, I continued conversationally, while you were busy documenting my supposed cognitive decline, I was documenting your systematic elder fraud. Oregon is a one-party consent state, which means every conversation I've recorded over the past week is completely legal evidence. I pulled out another folder. Margaret Rosenberg, my attorney, has also done some fascinating research on Morgan's background. Apparently, this isn't her first attempt at guardianship fraud. There are at least 3 other elderly victims in Oregon and California who lost their homes and independence to Morgan's estate transition services. Morgan finally found her voice. You can't prove anything. Everything we discussed was about your welfare. Really? I interrupted. Is that why you've been consulting with Dr. Kellerman about my competency without my knowledge or consent? Is that why you arranged for a property assessment of my home without telling me? Is that why you've been fabricating incidents of confusion that never actually happened? I stood up, looking around the table at the faces of people who had been planning to steal my life. Here's what's actually going to happen. Morgan, you have 24 hours to remove yourself and all your belongings from my house. Dr. Kellerman, if you ever attempt to provide professional opinions about my mental state again, I will file complaints with every medical board in Oregon. And David and Helen, you can explain to your daughter that elder fraud is a federal crime that carries a 20-year prison sentence. I walked to the door, then turned back for my final words. Oh, and Morgan? Next time you want to commit fraud against an elderly person, you might want to make sure they're not a retired high school teacher who spent 35 years dealing with manipulative teenagers. We know all your tricks, and we're much better at documentation than you are. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Morgan's parents left that very evening, barely pausing to gather their belongings before fleeing to their hotel. Dr. Kellerman disappeared so quickly she left her briefcase behind, clearly recognizing that her involvement in the fraud had been thoroughly documented. And Jude. My grandson sat at that dining room table long after everyone else had gone, staring at the evidence of what he'd almost participated in. Grandma, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, I didn't understand. I thought Morgan really cared about your welfare. I looked at this young man I'd raised, seeing both the child who'd spent summers learning to fish in the Willamette River and the adult who'd nearly cost me my independence and my home. Jude, caring about someone's welfare means respecting their autonomy, not taking it away. Within 48 hours, Morgan was gone. She packed her belongings in silence, avoiding eye contact with both Jude and me. As she loaded her luxury car for the last time, she turned back with one final attempt at manipulation. You'll regret this, Bea. You're going to end up alone in this big house, and when you fall down those stairs or have a medical emergency, no one will be there to help you. I smiled serenely from my front porch. Morgan, I've been taking care of myself for 75 years. I managed just fine before you arrived, and I'll manage even better now that you're gone. Margaret Rosenberg filed criminal charges the following week. Morgan was arrested on federal elder fraud charges, with additional counts in California and Oregon for her previous victims. The investigation revealed a sophisticated network of professionals who specialized in what they called wealth transition services, a euphemism for systematically defrauding elderly people out of their assets and independence. Frank Morrison, the Sacramento widower from Morgan's previous case, was able to contest his guardianship with the evidence we'd uncovered. At 78, he moved out of the memory care facility and back into an apartment of his own, his dignity and autonomy restored. But the most important resolution was with Jude. My grandson spent weeks processing how completely he'd been manipulated, how his genuine love for me had been weaponized against both of us. He moved back to his Portland apartment, but our Sunday dinners resumed, different now, more honest, built on a foundation of respect rather than assumption. I learned something important, he told me one evening as we cleared dishes from this dining room table that was once again mine. Love isn't about making decisions for someone else because you think you know what's best. It's about supporting their right to make their own decisions, even when you disagree with them. 6 months later, I was contacted by the Oregon Attorney General's office. They wanted my help developing educational materials about elder fraud, using my experience to help other families recognize the warning signs before it was too late. I agreed immediately, understanding that my victory was meaningless if other elderly people continued to fall victim to predators like Morgan. Today, as I sit in my garden watching Edgar's roses bloom in their 4th spring since his death, I reflect on how close I came to losing everything that mattered. Not just my house or my financial security, but my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to determine my own future. I'm still Beatrice Henley, still the owner of this Victorian house on Maple Street, still the keeper of 43 years of memories shared with Edgar. But I'm also something I never expected to become, a warrior who fought for her right to age with dignity and won. The house is quiet again, but it's a peaceful quiet, not the silence of isolation, but the contentment of a woman who knows exactly who she is and exactly what she's worth. And anyone who thinks otherwise is welcome to try to prove me wrong. They'll discover, as Morgan did, that underestimating a retired teacher is the biggest mistake they'll ever make. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.